Looking forward to that.
Likewise, here we are live. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Mike Mumola, and I will be moderating or hosting today with Steve Elfrink on behalf of Nobody Studios. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and specifically MDMA and what's happening in and around that space. We'll be going for approximately 20 minutes, and in that 20 minutes, we are going to get in as much information as we can to help you understand what's going on and why it's important. And without any further ado, to my dear friend, colleague, and in many ways with regard to this space, mentor, Steve Elfrink, nice to see you as always. And for the benefit of our audience, could you give them a bit of your background and experience, specifically with and around MDMA and psychedelics, and what brings you here today?
Sure. Love to. Wonderful to see you, Mike, as always, and always appreciate Nobody Studios and Webdelics and their efforts to get this information out to the masses around psychedelics. A lot of excitement around psychedelics and a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges we're finding out is right now with MDMA. And so I'll keep it brief, promise, overview. So I'm some guy who's been in the trenches with psychedelics for going on 40 years now, starting recreationally, but then diving deeper into the therapeutic aspects of psychedelics. And something that changed my life, saved my life. So a huge advocate for psychedelic medicines. And I've worked with, above ground and underground with most psychedelics. I've worked with MDMA personally, with other folks, worked with ibogaine, psilocybin. I'm a legal psilocybin provider in the state of Oregon, and now pretty much all above ground. And currently I'm working in private practice, focusing primarily on PTSD, complex PTSD, dissociative PTSD, but working with more of a body-focused approach, and also working with psycholytic dosing or small dosing, primarily with ketamine in a model where the client self-administers. But my specialty, if anything, my passion is PTSD. And it's what, part of it is just born out of my own experience of long-term sexual abuse, physical abuse.
Steve, if I could just stop you there for a second. When you say PTSD, I know a lot of us have an idea of what we think that is, and we've heard about it in the media. But when you say PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, what is it? How does it affect, people in their lives? Typically, we think of very often veterans who have been through PTSD. But are there other forms that affect people? And what is it that people are experiencing when they have the PTSD?
Great question, and I appreciate the interruption and just dive it in. So thank you, Mike. So PTSD, I think, is somewhat misunderstood, and trauma in general is misunderstood in the general public. So a lot of people think PTSD, which, like you said, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a war vet, and that can be someone with PTSD, someone who had, was sexually assaulted, physically abused, that's kind of PTSD. But there's one thing I think that really needs to get out there more is the spectrum of PTSD, and also just understanding the spectrum of trauma. And typically, if there's trauma, there's going to be PTSD. So if someone is has had some level of trauma, say even if they're 18 and something happened, and that event is still, affecting them today, where they're triggered, they have a startle response, they're dealing with different levels of anxiety, depression, but typically that can be drawn back to that event. So things that are showing up in the here and now are a lot of times from a single event trauma, or it can be multiple events, but that's PTSD. So you're having post-traumatic stress, and that stress could be anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts, not feeling safe. That's a common thing with PTSD. That's not safe, not safe, not safe, hypervigilance. So the one thing as a big takeaway from this, PTSD is complicated. People are complicated creatures. So what someone shows up, from an event, but then based on what the previous events, what their childhood was like, if there was abuse as a child, if there was, when did it start? How many times? Was there someone good in their life to balance out the trauma? So all these add to the complexity of PTSD and trauma. And then now we have complex PTSD if there's multiple events. We have dissociative PTSD if someone also has dissociation in their system. And that we could do a whole show on. But bottom line, trauma is complicated, people are complicated. A lot of times not one size fits all.
Okay, understood. Thank you for that. And with that in mind, what is MDMA? And that leads to my next question is why the interest in PTSD with regard to MDMA? But first, let's unpack that first question just generally for the audience to understand what is MDMA?
Yeah, so great question. And what's always fascinating about most of these substances, they have a long, kind of sometimes interesting history. MDMA goes way back to 1912 with the company still in existence, Merck. A lot of these chemical research, pharmaceutical companies they just create a ton of different chemicals. Some they put attention to, some they don't. MDMA was one of those. And MDMA stands for methylene dioxy methamphetamine. So a big name that got condensed to MDMA. So MDMA 1912 appears but doesn't go anywhere. And then in the 1970s, a wonderful saint, I'll call him a saint, Alexander Shulgin or Sasha Shulgin, who was a chemist that came out of Dow, another chemical factory, but left that and started doing his own research with different chemicals, different compounds, kind of resurrected, digging through the annals of all these different obscure chemical reference or compounding, papers, abstracts, found MDMA and thought, hey, that sounds interesting. So Sasha is the one who really brought MDMA to the masses, to the world, guy just in a small, awesome lab in Northern California. So he was the first one to really synthesize MDMA and start to experiment on himself with it and found this, wow, this could be huge for therapy. So in the 70s, he kind of started launching, with a select few, there's always little collectives that were always, even after everything got criminalized when the war on drugs happened, but there's always been pockets of folks still focused on this work because they believe in it, because it works. So Sasha started working with a small group of different therapists. Leo Zeff was probably the biggest, known as the secret chief. And he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sessions of MDMA, working on folks with trauma, anxiety, depression, also started working with couples, and he trained other therapists. So kind of the heyday, and the cool thing, MDMA was legal then. It's under the radar, but full use. And so in the 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of therapists doing a lot of, not research, but just doing a lot of positive, good work with MDMA, and it was working. Then also, the same time as, just like LSD, it went kind of from the lab, the therapist, into the streets. So then in the 80s, MDMA got known as kind of a party drug, a rave drug,
ecstasy.
Yeah, it got renamed ecstasy. And it's that whole thing with a lot of these medicines, set and setting, headphones, eye shades, right environment. It can be therapeutic. Take ecstasy or MDMA at a club, it's beautiful music going, collective consciousness of people just bouncing together in a beautiful vibe of, ecstasy.
Yeah. So when we get to that, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, but then, so there was so much promise, but then it got, War on Drugs Part 2, 1985 or 86, it got shut down by the government. So now it's illegal. But then there was enough advocacy, enough, belief in that medicine that a study, I think 1995, 96, Charlie Grobe, God bless Charlie Grobe, and he's one of the, there's so many luminaries in this world, and Charlie's just one of those that has always been in favor of this and doing the work. He started a study back then looking at safety and efficacy, primarily in cancer patients, and got through. There was one study that tried to get pushed in the 80s, 86, but it got rejected. And then in 95, 96, Charlie got one pushed through, showed safety and efficacy. And then it was really in the 2000s with Rick Doblin and MAPS that really, really, really just launched MDMA, got millions and millions of dollars. And they're the ones who really got it pushed through the FDA process from a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
Got it. And so that's a perfect segue into that final part of the question that I had. What is that you're referring to with regard to the FDA? We all have a pretty good understanding of who the FDA is and their interest in MDMA.
So FDA is the Federal Drug Administration. They approve every drug. So, whether it's Valium or cancer drug or, any drug that's a prescription drug has to go through FDA approval. And it's a long, laborious process. And it's also a very old school process. It's very kind of white. I always got to be careful what I say nowadays. But a very, conservative background. And, they're used to looking at just molecules and hardcore data, black and white data. And so what's kind of happened, but before I get to what happened with current state of FDA reviewing MDMA, one thing I want to quickly touch on is how MDMA works. So there's all this excitement about MDMA. There's been all this interest in the studies of it, but how does it work? And this can go pretty quick. It's pretty simple. So the beautiful thing about MDMA, it shuts down what's called the amygdala. So amygdala is like our fear center, flight or fright. So also we're startled. What kicks in is the amygdala. And then that floods us with adrenaline, gets us into that fight or flight, get out. But the challenge with anyone with trauma, if you're trying to, in like standard talk therapy, talk to a vet about that time X, Y, or Z happened, as soon as you start talking about that, they're going to get triggered. Or if it's someone who went through an assault, you start going towards it, there's all this unresolved trauma around that, and they get triggered. So also it's like, fight or flight, not safe, not safe. They're back in that place because the amygdala goes full on. So it's hard to talk someone through something when they're in a panic state. So one thing with MDMA, it kind of basically calms down or shuts down the amygdala quite a bit. So that fear center's down. So now a person can start going towards an event without getting triggered. And then the bonus is also MDMA triggers a flood of oxytocin. So the day you were born, mama's holding you, you're flooded with oxytocin. Oxytocin is also known as the love drug. It's a bonding. It's actually a low-grade opiate. So but it puts you into this like love, puppy love place. So you have this ability to go towards some traumatic event, but you're also in the safe environment. So even, you're with oxytocin, so you're with a guide or whoever's facilitating it, but you're going to feel a bond with that guide. You're going to feel safe. And that safety allows you to go towards and then start to unravel some of this stuff. So that's kind of, base on how MDMA works. So what's interesting, we've taken MDMA, which has shown incredible promise as far as efficacy, known that it does help folks with trauma. Unequivocally, it should be approved by, most of us who have been working with it know it works. But you take that drug that had a history of, recreational use, you put it in front of an FDA. First step was advisory boards. But they don't know anything about psychedelics. They're not psychedelic advocates. Most of them haven't done psychedelics. So they're psychedelic naive. And so what happened, to kind of cut to the chase here, is last Friday, because this was the final hurdle to get MDMA approved. So all the studies are done, and what MAPS or Lykos was split off from MAPS to finalize the study and then also launch the MDMA treatment programs.
And by approved, do you mean if this would have been approved, it would have been available to help people across the United States with PTSD, et cetera?
Yes, it would have been a stamp of, yes, we approve. It might have been, yes, we approve and tweak this, but it would have been, yes, let's move ahead. So what happened is FDA said no. So what they followed was the advice of an independent review, ICER, I had to write it down because ICER is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, and then also independent FDA advisory board. Yeah. Both of those entities said don't approve it. So the FDA could have gone against that, but I think it's like 70% of the time, they're going to follow the advisory board. But we had kind of this perfect storm of challenge where, one, we have, a system that's never approved a psychedelic drug before. So this is the first time, a group has gone to the FDA and said, really, here, we want to get this approved for, mass consumption for Americans. So huge hurdle there, because one, the FDA is going to be super cautious because this has never been done before.
Right.
Then also you have a group of people that don't understand psychedelics, and also people, and this is where it gets kind of muddy also for the FDA and the advisory boards, where this was the first time that a drug that was going for approval was tied to therapy.
Right.
So the FDA is used to, oh, we're going to approve this drug for cancer treatment of the thyroid, and very specific, and they're looking at, the success of that molecule, but nothing tied to therapy.
Mm.
So the way the study was presented was it's the medicine plus the therapy. And then what I think made it muddier too, and I want to reiterate, I'm an advocate for MDMA. MDMA should be legal, but also just realizing the context of where we are. And then also, so a therapy model was tied to the molecule, tied to MDMA, but it wasn't a therapy model that was an evidence-based. So it's based on Grothian theories of the innate healer, inner wisdom. I mean, all things, I believe in, and most people working with these medicines believe in. Also, the irony of this is, psilocybin is going through a similar process of FDA approval, but with psilocybin, there's not a therapy model tied to it.
Got it.
But people are using that same language because there's the integration, there's the session, there's preparation, MDMA, or preparation, the session, integration. The same language is being used, but MAPS chose to tie the therapy to the molecule. And now you have these guys who don't know about therapy. So something that's now tied to it, talking about innate healer, inner wisdom and a molecule. What? And then Grothian theories. What's Grothian theories? Not understands, they have no history of Stan Grof.
So agreed. So if you could give us just a kind of a 1 or 2 line, like a summary of where we are now. Where are we with regard to MDMA and PTSD and psychedelics?
Yeah. So for me, this is a setback. For me, it's not surprising. But what we've got is, so right now, FDA has said no. MAPS or Lycos is going to try to do, hey, give us another shot, try to appeal it a bit. But typically, if FDA says no, it's no matter how many protests or whatever's going on. I mean, I'm all for if that feels right for people. So we're looking at they want another phase 3 study to go forth, which will take about another 2 years, which is a pretty significant setback. But the one thing, for me, there's other models. The model I work, I'm not trying to make a pitch for what I work with, but working with lower dose ketamine, working with a more body focused focus. There's ways to work through PTSD. And I think also within the veteran community, working with psilocybin, with brothers, I think that's a beautiful container for PTSD. And there's, legal psilocybin in Oregon, where I live. There's also soon to be legal psilocybin in Colorado.
And some other states have some bills that are pending, and that's very exciting. So we continue to move forward. Steve,
yes,
absolutely. Thank you for your time. If there are any last things you want to add, I know we're coming in on time. People that are interested can find out more about you and what we're doing at Webdelics. It's webdelics.com, webdelics.com, or on social media. And Steve, as always, thank you so much for all of your insight.
And if anyone wants to reach out to me, my company is OMTerra, OMTERRA, and it's just omterra.org.
Thank you
so
much.
And then I think the biggest thing, just my final thing, and we're at the last minute, keep the faith.
Right.
We can get through this. I mean, we've been working on this in decades and decades. It's not going to stop. And this is also learning the art of the pivot. Okay.
Yeah.
And, what other options? And also, final, the power of the states. Oregon approved a Schedule 1 drug, psilocybin, for use. Colorado's doing the same thing. What can we do to get MDMA approved at the state level? The power of the people is the most important thing right here.
Absolutely agree.
Hopeful. We will persevere. Yeah. Stay on mission.
Continue to move forward. Thank you as always. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care and have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone out there. Stay safe.
Everyone.